morning. Welcome to the Yale Philanthropy Conference Community-Led Funding Strategies for Shifting Power panel discussion. We will be getting started in about a minute or so. And we encourage those of you joining us to share your name, your role, your organization, and also where you're based so we know who's in this space with us. All right, so I think we should get started. Thank you. Good morning. Happy Friday, folks. Thank you for joining the Yale Philanthropy Conference 2022 panel discussion on community-led funding strategies for shifting power. My name is Yolanda Caldera Durant, and I am Vice President for Community Strategies at the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven. I will be moderating today's discussion. We're excited to bring together this panel of knowledgeable colleagues to discuss this timely and important topic. As I mentioned at the outset, please introduce yourself in the chat and please tell us your name, your role, the organization, and where you're based so we get to know who's joining us. So this panel brings together funders from Connecticut, New York, and Canada to discuss strategies for effective community-led grant making. So today we will explore what it means to practice trust-based philanthropy, challenges organizations face in adopting participatory funding practices, and resources that can support them. We will also delve into how the COVID-19 pandemic and the racial justice reckoning has impacted funders' approaches and more. We hope this conversation will be useful and informative to those of you who are seeking to launch community-led funding practices and those who want to deepen their experience in community-led grant making. After we hear from our panelists, we will have time for Q&A, and we invite you to put your questions in the Q&A section, which is on the top right-hand side of your hop-in screen, and we will respond to as many as we can in the time that we have for Q&A. Also, immediately after this panel discussion, we will have an informal networking session where we can continue to talk about this topic with each other. The link to this session is in the description below, or will be put in the description below by Kayla Murphy, our conference organizer. We will also post the link in the chat at the end of the session. The link will take you to a different session that's not being recorded, and it will allow up to 20 people to share their video. So now I'm pleased to introduce you to each of our guest panelists. And we invite you to read their bios and learn more about their backgrounds in the conference materials. First, we are joined by Alyssa Borden, Vice President of Community Impact at the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving here in Connecticut. Also, we're joined by Marina Nuri, Associate Director, Canada Programs and Strategy at the World Education Services Marian Acefa Fund. And then last but not least is Gabriela Quintanilla, who's Hudson Valley Program Officer at the NorthStar Fund. So we're going to get started with Gabriela. So I'd like to ask you briefly, what's the role that you play at your organization? And then what does community-led philanthropy mean to your foundation? And how do you put this into practice? And in what ways has your foundation built and or shared power through these practices?
Yes, good morning. It's great to be here with you all. My name is Gabriela, and I am the Hudson Valley Program Officer at NorthStar Fund. And what that means is that I manage the portfolio in the Hudson Valley. NorthStar Fund is a social justice community fund that does grant making in New York City and the Hudson Valley. So I manage the portfolio in the Hudson Valley. And what community-led philanthropy means to us is that, decision-making power is at the hands of the people who are being most directly impacted, right? The people who are at the forefront doing social justice change in communities of color, indigenous communities, and Black-led movements. And how do we put these values into practice at NorthStar Fund? Is that we have what we called community funding committees. So it's a very different approach that started all the way back in the 80s, right? It's at the heart of what the goal was in creating NorthStar Fund, which was we didn't want it to be just your regular fund in terms of going about grant making. We wanted the decision making power to be in the grassroots, and so the community funding committees are a group of activists that make decision about our grant making, and they decide where we should be investing our funds. And that's really powerful because it's not up to me as the program officer to make those decisions, or the board at NorthStar Fund, but is the people who are on the ground, who know what the community needs, that decide where our funding should go.
Thank you, Gabriela. And now I'd like to pose a question to Alyssa.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Alyssa Gordon, Vice President of Community Impact at the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. And the Hartford Foundation is a 97-year-old community foundation that serves the greater Hartford region. So we've been around a long time, and in some ways that's really great because we know we have many relationships and long history of those relationships in our community. At the same time, being around that long means that oftentimes we also have a lot of history in terms of institutionalized practices and processes that are pretty ingrained. I would say about 3 years ago, our board approved a strategy framework that focuses really on the well-documented persistent disparities in the greater Hartford region. And over the past 2 years, we've more explicitly defined our commitment as working in partnership to contribute to dismantling structural racism and advancing equitable opportunity, particularly for greater Hartford's Black and Latino communities. And the impetus for our foundation to think about community-led grant-making practices, which I would say lives across our community impact efforts and actually across the organization, from grant making to learning and evaluation to our development work with Giving Circle. It also lives across a continuum of that participation from community informed to community led. We're not really, I would say we are not in the space of fully community owned at the Hartford Foundation. And, with our strategy framework, we knew that making progress toward these priorities required us to shift power in terms of changing who benefits from the resources that we steward, but also who make the decision about what needs to prioritize, how to address those needs, the allocation of resources. And I would also say that COVID kind of, exacerbated some of this thinking. It really forced us to think differently, to understand and listen more closely to the ground about what the needs were, who needs were getting met and not met, and why not. Learn from different kinds of organizations that were serving community members, and also getting comfortable very fast with working in less structured ways.
Thanks, Alyssa. And now, Marina, we would like to hear how this all, came together at your organization.
Thank you, Yolanda. And thank you for organizing this panel. It's a very important discussion, and I'm happy to share about our work. So as Yolanda said, my name is Marina Nouri. I'm the Associate Director of Programs and Strategy at the WES World Education Services Mary Masefa Fund. So just quickly, because you might not know us, World Education Services is a social enterprise, and its core business is evaluation of foreign education credentials for immigrants, refugees, international students who come to the US and Canada. And Mary Masefa Fund, where I work, is a philanthropic arm of WES. And our mission is to advance social and economic inclusion so that immigrants and refugees can achieve their aspirations and thrive. We are quite a new funder. We started our grant making in the US in 2019 and in Canada in 2020. And I'm responsible for our grant making in Canada. So Coming back to your question, I think shifting power to communities is core to our mission. We always talk about how to center immigrants and refugees in the decisions that impact them, how to build the bench of immigrant and refugee leaders. So we have been grappling with this question for a while. And while we started implementing some of the trust-based philanthropy approaches from the beginning, participatory grant making is still quite new to us. Initially, we experimented with just having evaluation committees for some of our open calls, and this evaluation committees consisted of different partners from the field, but mostly advisor-level partners, not necessarily people with lived experience. But after our first year of grant making in Canada in 2020, we decided to experiment more with participatory approaches, and our board approved a significant part of our grant making budget for 2021 that would go just towards participatory grant making. So kind of not knowing where the funding would go, what the theme would be, they just approved a specific envelope. And we decided to do a pilot. So we selected a third-party partner, Tamarack Institute, which is a Canadian nonprofit with a lot of experience with community engagement. And they selected a community, which is called Peel. It's a community in Ontario, a municipality with about like more than 1 million people. 50% of these people are immigrants and refugees. And so this pilot is our first fully participatory model where we try to give all decision-making power to the community. So Tamarack is just facilitating the community consultations. They will be distributing funding based on the decisions made by the community members. So this is the pilot that has been going on for the last 6 months. Tamarack selected, helped to identify a table of community representatives who have been going through consultations, trying to identify the main needs of the community, the gaps, trying to define the funding needs, the parameters of the funding call, what kind of solutions they will be considering. And so right now the call for proposals is open, and over the next months or so, the community members will be reviewing the applications and making decisions on where the funding will go. So that's kind of the pilot we are doing that I'm happy to share more about.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you, Gabriela and Alyssa, for just helping us to understand more about how community-led philanthropy has unfolded at each of your organizations. I wanted to dig into a little bit more about kind of the why, like the why your community, your organization, your foundation decided to adopt these types of funding practices. And the terms seem interchangeable between community-led grant making, participatory grant making. So I'm just interested in hearing a little bit more about, how your organization landed where it did, and not to necessarily say that it will stay there. It sounds like this work is evolving, depending on how long each of your organizations has been doing it. So Gabriela, I'd like to come back to you about just tell us a little bit more about how this unfolded and why the NorthStar Fund decided to do this work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I briefly mentioned before that this was something that the notion of community-led funding started since the beginning, when NorthStar Fund was born. So, I think that's awesome, and we have kept that up until now. And in our expanding, our efforts into the Hudson Valley, that also was a crucial part, right? Like we can't do this work if we are not investing the time in creating, community funding committees. And I would like to explain a little bit more about that. So, it's a group of activists that come from different issue areas in New York City and the Hudson Valley, and they come together to discuss the applications that we've gotten, from different groups. There's a review process that takes place beforehand, and then they meet in person to discuss, who has applied. And there's this whole process of discussing any conflict of interest that they might have, right? Because that's important. Because after all, they might also be grantees of ours themselves. So it starts to get a little bit complicated, which I know we'll talk later on about some conflicts, right? But the beauty of it all is that they have the decision-making power at the table. And that's important to NorthStar Fund, because we are funding organizations that are bringing about change and are shifting, power structures, right? And so if we're not doing that ourselves, right, how can we be transparent to the work that we're trying to fund? So that is, where we're coming from in keeping the community funding committees moving forward. It's just like how we operate, and we couldn't do what we do without that.
Thanks, Gabriela. So Alyssa, how did this unfold at the Hartford Foundation? And this is a particularly interesting example because of the way community foundations are structured. So I'm sure folks are very interested to hear how the work got started and why at the Hartford Foundation.
Absolutely. I mean, typically, I think community foundations, our community, in addition to our donors and broad stakeholder constituents, I think our community, typically our closest relationships are often with our nonprofits in terms of grant making and understanding needs in community. And I think given what I shared a few moments ago about our strategic priorities, we really understood that we needed to, also open our door wider and start to build different and new relationships with not only nonprofits, but also resident-led group efforts that are closer to having firsthand knowledge of their community, strategies to address them, and have trusting relationships also with residents. Those intermediaries that have the more trusting residents, maybe a longer history also of those relationships than the community, a 97-year-old community foundation. So a couple of examples are putting this into practice is last year we granted about $2.5 million, about $1 million each, to the Prosperity Foundation, which is a Connecticut Black-led and serving community fund, and Hispanic Federation, which is Latino-led, Latinx serving nonprofit membership organization and funder. And no condition, just shared the money almost funder to funder. No condition on where the resources would be spent, and it was a way for us to really, transfer this set of resources to funders who were closer to community, closer as an intermediary to those nonprofits that are led and primarily serving Black and Latinx people, and having more direct contact to communities. And so we also, at the same time, also provided some additional, multi-year flexible funds to support the foundation's own Black Giving Circle Fund and Latino Endowment Fund, which is a group of residents who come together and pool their dollars to impact needs in the community. Similarly, at the same time, as part of when we rolled out our strategy, we worked to help create an advisory council of artists and arts leaders of color. They've chosen the name Artists of Color Unite. And the Artists of Color Unite work with us to make recommendations for distributing about $400,000 of the foundation's unrestricted dollars in the region to create kind of long-term support structures that would benefit artists of color in the region, with a focus on Black and Brown and Indigenous artists. And then thirdly, we probably a most expansive effort over the last 3 years have been our Greater Together community funds. And in 2019, we launched these funds, which provide every town in our region, so 29 towns, with about $150,000 to support community residents in taking ownership around the needs in their towns and encourage inclusive civic engagement. It also connects the foundation, really anchors us in each one of our 29 towns in a very intensive way. And then this effort really followed a 2018 listening tour that we did in every single one of our 29 towns, where foundation staff were able to hear from residents about the challenges in their own community. And one of the things we really heard was, we know our communities best. How do we, could we have more ownership over how dollars are spent? This was a response to that with a very intentional process that creates resident-led advisory councils to do the grant making. However, also providing us different kinds of support to ensure an inclusive process that reflects the diversity in that community.
Thank you, Alyssa. There was a clarifying question in the chat about if you could repeat the names of the two organizations, the Black-led and Hispanic-led, you mentioned.
The Prosperity Foundation is the Black-led community fund. They actually were at one point, I believe, part of the New Haven Community Foundation, and then was a subsidiary, and then became their own community fund, nonprofit public charity. And then the other is the Hispanic Federation, which is a national nonprofit membership organization, but they have their affiliate in Connecticut that is focused on Connecticut.
Great, thank you, Alyssa. And thank you for walking us through how this work started and how it's unfolded and the different forms that it's taken and how it's evolved. So Marina, we'd love to hear from you about how community-led grant making got started at the West Mariana Sepa Fund.
Sure. Well, I think similarly, I think it was just the right timing. First of all, that was the time, COVID happened, impacts of the pandemic, Black Lives Matter movement, greater push for truth and reconciliation in Canada as regards to Indigenous peoples. So it kind of heightened the need for funders to change their traditional practices and find ways to shift power to the people who are impacted by this social or economic or environmental difficulties. And I think internally, as I said, the question of power has been something that we've been really grappling with from the beginning. We were trying to identify ways how we can advance more equity through our work. And it was clear that we can't really ask from our grantee partners to be more equitable in the way they work without being more equitable ourselves. And I can just share an example of how this specific participatory grant-making pilot came together, because as I said, it was based on some of the initial learnings from our first year of grant-making in Canada. So I remember in 2020, when we were just starting in Canada, I was tasked with developing our grant-making strategy for the year and identifying priorities. And I tried to be very inclusive in this process. So I had lots of consultations with various advisors from the field. I spoke to other funders, immigrant serving organizations, policymakers, used a lot of research. Also informally, I spoke to a lot of immigrants in my networks. I am an immigrant myself, but still it was not enough. I felt to make a decision on what exactly out of this whole variety of issues that concern immigrants and refugees and racialized communities, what issue should we choose? And also we have a national mandate, what location should we choose, what community we should choose. So COVID made things honestly a bit easier to decide because pandemic put things into their perspective. But then another difficulty came at the point of evaluating all the applications we received in this first year. So we received such a variety of solutions for different types of populations. And of course, we could evaluate them based on predefined evaluation criteria, like which solution is more innovative or which solution can advance more systems change. But at the same time, I always felt, who am I to decide which population is more important or which solution for which population is more important. So I always felt like it was just too much responsibility to be held in the hands of a funder. So that's how we kind of started advocating for this pilot, and hopefully this pilot will, the learnings from this pilot will help us adopt these participatory practices more broadly within our whole grant making in the organization.
Marina, thank you. And I think what you're sharing about, one person having all that power to decide and really shifting that and flipping that, really underscores what we're talking about here today. Now I want to turn to Alyssa regarding discussing with us any challenges you've encountered doing this kind of work, and if you have, what kind of challenges have you seen and how have you addressed them? And finally, what has been the most valuable learning to come out of these challenges for you?
Sure. I guess I would say, simply put, this work is very different than what an institutional community foundation, is used to doing. It's from everything to how we work in terms of our processes, the way we work in terms of, who we're working with. I think, there are real concerns about, how do we mitigate conflict of interest when we're kind of ceding the control and power. And, a quick example of something, that was one of those many aha moments when we were working with the Artists of Color Unite Arts Advisory Council group. Oftentimes because of the systemic exclusion and under-resourcing of organizations that are led and by people of color, oftentimes you are seeing the participants and who are also then are the potential applicants for funding. And there may not be that wide array of strong, stable organization that can come to the table as the participants in terms of having the capacity they need, either to take the time out from the day-to-day work they're doing to come and sit at a participatory grant making table. So really kind of thinking through our own practices and policies and what does conflict of interest mean and why, thinking differently about it, and understanding some of the structural reasons why we need to think differently about it. I would say in terms of the most valuable learning that we've had in addition to that is really for ourselves internally being real and intentional about organizational readiness at the outset, and then continually checking in with ourselves and with our co-participants throughout the work. It really means readiness across all layers, our board, our leadership teams, our staff, our donors, and even community members. Everybody has expectations about what it means to work with the Community Foundation and what it means to do participatory grant making. We've really had to kind of set clear expectation for ourselves and others about what we're, as a foundation, what we're ready to do and what we're not ready to do, and what decisions we are ready to cede, power and control around, and what we may not be ready for, and why, what's giving reasons why, and kind of having those honest and often difficult conversations about the why and the readiness. I would say the other thing I would just lift up is making sure that staff have the skills and the supports they need to do this work. It's very time intensive. It's emotionally hard work, especially when the work is centering racial justice. There's unfamiliar skills that sometimes program officers who, may not come to, philanthropy with, in terms of everything from facilitation, and building trusting relationships, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, and the traditional funder or program officer experience may not kind of have naturally garnered that experience. Oftentimes we're used to often being the most popular person in the room because we're arriving with the checkbook. That's not the scenario when you're coming into a participatory space. So. I would also say equally making sure that community members have the supports and the skills that they need, grant making 101, knowing the processes that are in place and where there's room to make change, stipends for their time as experts in part of the process. We're all getting paid. They need to be paid for their expertise and their time. Backbone infrastructure from everything we, with our Greater Together community funds, just how to use a Google document. Volunteers, may not know some of the things we take for granted being in the office with our IT staff and accounting, and finance department. So I think those are probably the biggest learnings that I'll start with, at least, and let my fellow panelists chime in now.
Thank you, Alyssa. Gabriela, let's turn to you. Can you tell us about the challenges that have come up in this work, and also how you've addressed them and what those valuable learnings have been for you coming out of those challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Elisa, you hit on so many points that are very similar to our work here at NorthStar Fund as well. And one of the things that I would like to highlight is time, right? And the need for compensating people for their time and their expertise. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges that we've encountered because we are relying on the time of activists who are doing this work on the ground, who, work that's very taxing, and people are overworked and exhausted. And we, scheduling meetings with them to review our portfolio sometimes can be very challenging. So we have 3 different CFC committees, and more than 10 people in each one of them. So that's a lot of scheduling different times and following up with people, and then the conflict of interest. That always gets really fascinating in the room, right? But we have this form that they fill out in advance. And then when the time comes to discuss their conflict of interest, people have been very open, about, I have this conflict, I can't weigh in on this decision. And it's a practice that, despite being a challenge, also goes really smoothly in the room because there is transparency, right? And an understanding of why we're doing this work and the importance of it. So I would say, striking a balance too, because on the stipend aspect of things and reimbursing people for their time, it's still very much a volunteered effort. It's not that, by no means they're getting a salary like the rest of us are. So acknowledging that as well, that this is just a small thing to appreciate their time. Those have been some of the challenges that I have experienced in this participatory grant making model. And then also, this past year we had like an open application for CFC members, which is something that we haven't done in the past. And we found that to be really helpful, because the other challenge is when you have people that have been there for a really long time, you sort of start to create this, exclusive club environment approach. And that is definitely not what we want to have, right? We want to have as much diversity in the room as possible in terms of issue areas, but also viewpoints and different backgrounds, right? And so we found that having an open call for CFC members, that was really healthy. And that was a really good approach to tackle one of those challenges of, being part of the Cool Kids Club. Yeah.
Thanks, Gabriela. And I have so many questions I want to ask you about that, but I'm going to hold them because I'm sure there are our guests joining us today may have some of those same questions. So let's turn to Marina now. Let's hear from you, Marina, about challenges, how they've been addressed, and also lessons learned from you coming out of these challenges. And understanding that your work is new. Definitely,
Yeah.
We understand that, but just very interested to hear at this point what those are.
No, absolutely. Yeah, we're just starting, so we don't have such depth of learnings as my colleagues in the panel. But from what we've noticed so far from implementing this pilot, first of all, at least in Canada, the awareness about participatory models is not very high within communities. So, for example, we first were identifying a community and that's how we identified the community to focus on. And we were expecting a lot of communities to be interested in this pilot. And eventually we received that many applications. And when I joined a few calls where our partner was explaining what this pilot is about, some people didn't even know what to ask, because I think what they're expecting is that they will be just pulled into another panel to, advise on how a program should be structured. I think they are not used to a model where actually they are the ones making decisions. And because you would think they would just jump on this opportunity, but we didn't see that. So I think like a learning is that definitely there needs to be more intentional awareness building about these models. I think another challenge that we haven't faced yet, but I'm sure we will as we start adopting this model more broadly within our organization, is that we're a national funder, and how to manage this model nationally, not within one specific community, is something that we will need to decide, and hopefully our pilot will also inform us on kind of just methods of building these relationships within one specific community that we can replicate. And I think also another challenge that we also haven't faced yet, because we are working with a partner, but I would expect that the skills on the team should be a little bit different if an organization is using participatory grant making. So I would expect that if it's our team who is managing these relationships with community panels and helping facilitate maybe some of the discussions, I think it's not maybe the pure program officer skills that are needed, but it's more of community engagement, relationship building with the community. So I would expect that that would also be something that we will need to consider going forward.
Thanks, Marina. So now I want to turn us to our next question about what advice would you give funders seeking to launch community-led grant making, and are there any specific resources or strategies that your foundation found helpful in getting this work off the ground? And let's start with Gabriela.
This is going to sound very simple, but it is. Listening, right? Listening to the community, because the community knows what they need. And, we've gotten a lot of feedback in the past. We're like super always open about feedback. When I talk to my grantees, is the number one thing I like to emphasize, because it's very important to me that I continue to listen to what the community needs, because at the end of the day, I believe that this work is not about me, but it's about responding to the needs of the community. And so that is why the community funding committees are so important to us, right? We have received feedback in the past that we not only need funding, but we need more capacity building support, right? So we've been thinking a lot about that and addressing those needs with different trainings, different programs that we can put in place. People need one-on-one support on like how to sustain their organizations, right? So we have office hours for our grantees that they can come and talk to us one-on-one. It's an open door policy, and not just with me as the program officer, but with the rest of our staff that have different skills, right? Like development, communications. And I think that's really important. Another feedback that we've gotten is just like having always a streamlined process, for grantees to apply. I think oftentimes we make this work really complicated, a lot of the sector, with a lot of reporting requirements. And if we're trying to support the work of the community, we need to facilitate that, not give them more work, right? And I think that this can be echoed across different issue areas. And so my advice is just continue to listen and implement those strategies that the community is telling you, to do this work more intentionally and with more heart, after all.
Thank you, Gabriela. Really important guidance for funders who want to do this work or want to deepen what they're already doing. So, Alyssa, what are your thoughts about this in terms of advice and resources to help funders with this work?
Well, everything Gabriela raised certainly resonates for me, and I think for the work we're engaged in at the Hartford Foundation. I would say what first comes to mind is going in accepting that the pace of the work will be different, likely different. Understanding that there's, will likely be a tension between the urgency to get dollars out, both felt but on the part of our case, the foundation, our foundation staff, leadership, our board, and donors, as well as the community, with balancing that sense of urgency to get resources out the door with also the need to slow down to do all the things Gabriella just raised to get this work right, taking the time that it does take to build, trust and relationships and, to have patience with group dynamics, even among the community participants, needing to work out their own group dynamics, in addition to the dynamics of having the community foundation, in our case, staff in the room with the community participants. The skill building that it takes, as I mentioned, for foundation teams, as well as for the community members.
Thank you, Alyssa. And Marina, I would love to hear from you about, how should funders get started with this? What advice would you give them? And also resources to help get this off the ground.
Well, my advice, just based on our experience, is for those who are still starting with this approach, is to not be afraid to start small, because I think the concept of participatory grant making may sound intimidating to some, especially larger, more maybe bureaucratic funders with established processes. So I think our example of just starting with a pilot, focusing on one specific community, is a good way to experiment with this process, to maybe test your board's flexibility with these types of decisions, with delegating the decision power to the community, and then learning from it and using these learnings to adopt these approaches more broadly within the organization. So I think starting small is definitely would be the first advice. I mean, I would also advise if you are just starting, especially if it's a pilot, to also work with a partner initially, because as I mentioned, I think if it's a new approach, it would be good to work with someone who already has done something like this and can also document the learnings for your organization. Because I think the idea is to not just start anyway, but also do it in a way that will help you learn and do it better next time on your own. So I think it's good to work with a partner and to just start with a smaller project or smaller envelope.
Thank you, Marina, for those really wise words. And I want to thank also Gabriela and Alyssa for really helping us understand how community-led grant making has unfolded in each of their foundations. And now we want to open it up to the audience for your questions. And I see we have a few questions so far, but please keep those questions coming, because we want to make sure that we have the chance to really dig a little bit deeper into today's discussion. So let's get started with a question that Ben Roble put in the Q&A. How does a community-led grant making model affect how you hire and train staff, for instance, hiring for facilitation skills versus research skills? So who would like to take a stab at that question?
I'm happy to take a first take. We actually have had the opportunity over the past year and currently to bring on new staff to the Community Foundation, and it has been with an eye, and new staff in the community impact area, and it's been with an eye to, working differently than we had in the past. And so, as mentioned, I think really looking for, asking those questions during the interview process and putting it explicitly into job postings about, preference for having, experience working, with participatory practices experience with equitable evaluation practices, because I think it's really important to not just think about participatory grant making, but really all the way, with the grant making comes the learning. So participatory learning practices as well. So that's been part of our explicit kind of preferred experience that we've had in job descriptions. I would say, certainly even something like volunteer management. It's not something typically you see in a community impact or a program officer's job description, and those group dynamic facilitation skills, as well as valuing lived experiences, either in the communities that we serve, and experiences with the issues and needs that we prioritize for the allocation of resources that we've heard are important to be addressed in our communities.
Thanks, Alyssa. Marina and Gabriela, anything else to add as far as Ben's question?
Well, so we haven't started kind of integrating the requirements related to participatory practices into our hiring processes. And actually, I'm going through a hiring process right now for a program manager in our team. But what we are trying to evaluate for, we definitely look for people with lived experience, because a lot of our grantee partners, most of our grantee partners are people with lived experience. And for us, it's important for our team to be able to kind of speak the same language and understand the issues firsthand. And also it helps to reduce the power imbalance. And another thing that we are trying to evaluate in the recruitment process is facilitation skills and ability to build trust-based relationships with partners. So I think we are always looking for some subtle cues in the interview process. So it's not necessarily looking at experience, but actually looking at personality as well, and kind of being very careful about how the person positions himself, herself, and how just trying to evaluate how this power imbalance will play out if this person was to lead conversations and facilitate discussions with our community partners. So I think that's very important for us at the moment.
Great. Thank you for sharing those insights, Marina. Gabriela, anything else you'd like to add?
For us, I would just say that, the priority is that staff and CFC members are really rooted in grassroots organizing, because that is what we support. And so it's very important to us that staff understand and have experience with grassroots organizing, because at the end of the day, that's really what, leads our participatory grant making model. So yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from Mary Kate Starkle, and I think, Gabriela, this question is for you about office hours. How often do you offer them to support capacity building for grantees? And do you open up office hours to a wider circle of organizations that know about your work, or is it just for current grantees?
Yes. So, right now we have a structure in place, which is once a month, up to 4 grantees at a time, that they can meet with us. And right now it's the communications team that's doing that, because there's a lot of questions within our grantees about technology, but also just like narrative stuff that have to do with their organization structure. And so we're offering that once a month, up to 4 grantees at a time. And we are, always open to have meetings with potential grantees that are curious about our criteria. And so we walk them through, what is our criteria and how we operate, right? Like, in being super clear that it's not up to me, because to what you mentioned before, Elisa, I think, there's this notion in the sector, right, that if you're a program officer, that you're the one that they should be talking to, and because there's something there, right, that they will get funding from you. And it's a little different, and it takes a little time to explain to people who are interested in getting funding from us, our process, right? And so it's also a little freeing for me, because I can just be fully transparent about what that looks like and how that decision is not up to me. So we offer in terms of like office hours that way in a more unconventional way. Always super open to anyone that wants to talk to us. And also we've done some trainings, about what it means to do community organizing, because that is defined differently in many different sectors, right? And so we've done trainings that is open to current grantees and also to potential grantees at the same time.
Thank you, Gabriela. Folks, if there are other questions, please pop them in the Q&A section. So we still have some time to respond to questions. So I'd actually like to flip things and invite Alyssa, Marina, Gabriela, if you have questions for each other that you'd like to ask based on today's discussion, I would invite you to do so. So if there's anything you want to know about each other or something that was mentioned that you want to just explore a little bit further, I would invite you to do that.
I guess one thing I would ask is how have you, addressed the challenge or thought about the challenge of balancing the staff-intensive resources in terms of time spent in this work, in terms of meeting time, relationship building time, capacity building time. It is a very different type of work. It's less transactional, it's less rote, it's less predictable in many ways. And that's something we're really, thinking a lot about right now in our work. And, as much as we want to expand, where else can we have an advisory group, where, at the same time, it's like, oh my gosh, this just, our staff only has so much bandwidth. And so just would love to hear a little bit about how you grappled with that issue.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it before, right? And I liked how you said what you said about that this is going to take time and the sense of urgency, because I think in the field a lot of the time there is this overwhelming sense of urgency to get dollars out the door, right, into the community. And so I think it's important that staff feel supported at all times. I think for us, we have this culture where it's like, how can I best support you? Like, what's on your plate? What are things that we can do together? And also sharing the work, right? So for example, I am the program officer for the Hudson Valley region, but that doesn't mean that I'm the only one who's holding all the knowledge about the Hudson Valley, or I'm the only one who knows about Hudson Valley grantees. It's very important to us that everybody in our team, especially our programs team, knows what's happening, right? And that I'm doing this with my colleagues. It's not just myself. I'm like the lead on the project, and I might have a little bit more of info, but it's important that this work is shared amongst the staff. And it also gets away from, feeling like this is all of my responsibility, right? Or, in getting away from this is not about me, because I'm the program officer for the Hudson Valley region today, but what, tomorrow we don't know, and there's going to be someone after me, and maybe it'll take a little time to hire someone else. And so it's important that the rest of the team knows what's happening so that the work can continue forward.
All right, I have a question. Well, will you guys think through if there are any questions you had? I was curious about, Gabriela, you had talked about the CFC committees and opening up that process, doing an open call for new members to join the committees. I was curious about like how long community members actually have participated in these different committees that, that have already existed, and just wanting to understand that a little bit more. Like, are there term limits for folks that join? Do you want to have like a regular rotation of people who serve in this role?
Yeah, the requirement is at least 2 years, because it takes a lot of time to get familiar with the structure of how the CFC works and understanding, when do we come together to discuss applications, what happens beforehand, what happens afterwards. And so we ask for 2 years, but we don't have a limit on, how many years after that someone can remain part of the CFC. I think a lot of it happens naturally, right? Like people's responsibilities change over time, and people just kind of say goodbye to us in a very organic way, but still remain supporting our work in a different role. So 2 years, and I think when we're having the discussions too about opening the process, that's not something that came from the staff or the board at NorthStar Fund, right? It's something that came also from the CFC members. This is how we wanted to go about, opening it up and expanding. And they were the ones who also reviewed the applications and conducted interviews with potential CFC members in the community.
Great. Thank you, Gabriela, for fleshing that out for us. So we have another question from our participants. So Betty Sugarman won. Betty, glad you could join us today. So her question is, what do you provide to community members who review requests? Do you provide the full application or a summary? And how much time is expected in the review process by the community team? So I'd like to kick this question over to Melissa to get us started.
Yeah, I guess I would say the 3 examples I shared today, at least the Artists of Color Unite group, our Greater Together Community Funds, even in our giving circles, even the decisions about the types of projects, efforts, and grantees that may be considered for funding is actually being derived from those groups. So it's not like they're reviewing application requests that have come in directly to the foundation. So that's not an area we've engaged in yet. But so it's a little bit different. So in those cases, the groups, and we're in collaboration and partnership and with support from the foundation, are gathering kind of doing the due diligence and gathering the information and reviewing the app and actually drafting the applications and considering them.
Thank you, Alyssa. Marina, any insights to share for Betty's question?
So for this pilot that we're implementing with the help of an external partner, the People's Panel, so the open call is open right now. So the applications have not come yet, but the People's Panel expressed the interest to review the whole application that comes in. They really kind of got the sense of ownership for this process, and they would not want the applications to be just summarized or certain parts of the applications to be shared. So they really want to review all of them, and they are also receiving a stipend, like a living wage equivalent in their region. So I think it also helps with being motivated and wanting to take up this full ownership for reviewing all the applications that come through. And at the same time, our partner Tamarack, they will be doing kind of more administrative due diligence, because they will be the ones who will be administering the grants still. So they will be taking over that part of the process.
Thank you, Marina. Gabriela, anything you'd like to add to Betty's question?
Yes. So we use the platform Submittable, right, for any applications that are coming to our foundation. And our CFC members have an account on Submittable as well. And so we just assign all the applications that have come in for, let's say, the Hudson Valley Community Organizing Fund, or the New York City Community Organizing Fund, or the Let Us Breathe Fund. We assign community funding committee members according to each fund, and they do review as they come in, right? And then when we come together to have a conversation about the applications, it's my job to just compile, the information for each organization that applied, to just walk us through, a reminder of, this is, an organization doing X, Y, and Z in each, this location. These are their priorities, and just facilitating the discussion for the CFC members. And then at the end, they make a decision at the end of that meeting.
Thank you, Gabriela. So we're coming to the end of our time. So I just wanted to thank Alyssa Gordon, Marina Nuri, and Gabriela Quintanilla for a really rich and thought-provoking discussion about community-led grant making. We want to invite those of you who want to continue the conversation to join us at the link that Kayla has dropped in the chat to continue this conversation. And that will not be a recorded session, and we can continue the conversation there. I want to thank all of you who joined us today to participate in this discussion. And thank you for your comments and your questions. And we look forward to seeing you again at next year's Yale Philanthropy Conference